bass drum. Don't you think you ought to know where the beat comes from? It's you. It's the tapping of a million shoes. And if you take another look around, you can see it in a different way. Hey, don't you think that you should have a total point of view? Because you can't be sure, no, you can't be sure until you've looked it over more than once. Because you can't, no, you can't, no, you can't, no, you can't, no, you can't be sure until you've looked it over more than once.
On Christmas vacation, I get to go to the San Diego Zoo. I get to pet lots of animals in the children's zoo. I get to ride the bus and fly the Sky Flurry. I get to see elephants and lions and gorillas and tigers and grizzly birds and...
Hey, did you know that children under 16 get in free? The San Diego Zoo, Southern California's most exciting entertainment value.
Now, you have to get this one right. All going to stay in the game. It's a true and false question. Here it comes. This is a true or false question to protect his identity. The Lone Ranger wore a false nose. Richie.
That's false.
That's false. He wore a mask, didn't he? Yes, okay. That is Richie. You're the winner of this island. Congratulations to you. You've won a...
Diamond Head, a new game show and the only game show taped in Hawaii, where contestants get a chance to win a share of $100,000 in cash and prizes. Premieres Monday at 3 on 4. Women, the LAPD has an interesting career for you. If you're between the ages of 21 and 34 and interested in a job of the future, call them. Channel 4, KNBC, Los Angeles.
We now bring you an NBC News special report. Here is NBC News correspondent Edwin Newman.
Well, this is a special report about the economy. The economy is now the chief preoccupation of the people of the United States, who nowadays must concern themselves with oil, energy crises, inflation, investor confidence, deflation, inventory liquidation, reflation, money supplies, stagflation, unemployment claims, the price of gold, capital investment, floating exchange rates, Federal Reserve policy, the solvency of banks, shrinking consumer credit, and so on. These are not lighthearted subjects, but then there's not much to be lighthearted about. Because if you think it was tough to make ends meet in 1974, wait till you hear about 1975. In this program, we're going to see how the gigantic increase in Arab oil prices added to our inflation. Somebody said that price increase was virtually an additional tax on the American people. We're going to see what recession does to towns and cities across the country. We're going to look into productivity, a sometimes elusive notion, and look into profits and prices. And we're going to see how Americans are coping with this unusual situation, rising prices and falling incomes. It wasn't very long ago that we were hearing a fair amount about economists fine-tuning the economy. A certain arrogance was involved in suggesting that that could be done. But more important, it implied that things would remain on a more or less even keel, with only minor adjustments, fine-tuning necessary. It has not worked out that way. In the year before the last Arab-Israeli war and the Arab oil embargo, our inflation was already running at over 7%. In the year or so since, it has been running at over 12%. Middle East oil now costs almost 4 times what it did before the embargo. It has also pulled up after it the cost of oil from other sources. So, on the average, we Americans pay almost 75% more for crude oil than we did before the Middle Eastern oil producers realized the strength of their position and acted on it. These are among the consequences. Gasoline is up about 35%. Heating oil is up 70%. Electricity costs 25% more. Those are average figures for the whole country, and they will be higher in 1975. John Palmer has been covering this story in the Middle East. He reports now on the newly rich Arab oil countries and their attitudes toward our problems.
Saudi Arabia, with the richest oil fields in the world, took in about $30 billion in 1974, far more money than it could use. Profits flowing into its treasury and to other Arab oil-producing states are so immense that no adequate plan has yet been devised for its disbursement. Despite the recent publicity given to a few investment bids, most Arabs are shying away from suggestions that they plow their new wealth back into Western economies. In reply to charges that high oil prices are driving the Western economies to ruin, oil producers say the rise in price has accounted for only a small percentage of the current inflation rate. That figure can be expected to grow, but it's still insignificant when compared to the damage that may yet be caused if the oil-producing states fail to recycle their petrodollars, the huge surplus of oil revenue they're piling up at the rate of $7 million an hour. Economic experts say the Arab oil producers are interested in working out some kind of a solution because they are paid in dollars and have an increasing stake in the American economy.
To some extent, we are partners. We buy very large quantities of goods, consumers' goods and producers' goods from the United States, and therefore it is in the interest of the Arabs to have a stable economy on the other side of the fence. However, I must say quite openly that the political stand of the United States government in fully supporting Israel, almost without qualification, makes many people feel quite ill at ease with regard to our partnership, our economic relationship with the United States of America.
As the petrodollars continue to flow out from the industrial nations and into the treasuries of the oil-producing states, a number of countries are taking what steps they can to correct the uneven balance of payments. In the long run, these solutions will almost certainly prove inadequate. The oil revenues will continue to multiply, and the Arab oil nations can absorb only a limited amount of Western goods and technology. The solution would appear to be a joint agreement between the oil-producing states and the oil-consuming nations on a plan to recycle this vast amount of surplus money. John Palmer, NBC News, Lebanon.
The United States is one of the few industrialized nations that gets most of its oil from its own resources, about 3/4 of it. And we account for more than 30% of the world's oil consumption. But we have only 5% of the world's oil reserves. More than 53% of those reserves are found in Saudi Arabia and other Middle Eastern countries. They help supply the United States with oil to make up what is not found here, but at great cost. It is a vulnerable position for us, as we learn in this interview that Louis Rukeyser, our economic consultant, had with oil analyst Charles Maxwell.
Former President Nixon suggested that the U.S. could be self-sufficient in energy by 1980. Many other observers regard that as an entirely unrealistic goal. What is your view?
The new word in Washington is interdependent, which simply means we will never achieve complete self-dependence, but we may bring dependence upon our allies and upon the oil-exporting countries down to something like 10% from today's 16% of total energy supplies that are being brought in. I think that to become independent would put an incredible financial burden on the American people. We would have to develop very uneconomic sources of fuels, which would act like the Arabs' high prices as an additional tax on our people. The chances are therefore, from a political point of view, that we will reduce our dependence on the foreigner, but never eliminate it.
To what extent will the continuing energy problems work to slow our recovery from this recession?
They will work to slow our recovery from the recession, undoubtedly. We could start with the automobile industry, which will be hurt by restrictions on gasoline use, whether they come in the form of allocations or higher prices or limitation on imports. Also, it will, the inflationary effect of higher oil prices will be felt by all of us as consumers in our electric bills. Obviously, if you spend more money on electricity, you're going to spend less on suits and handkerchiefs and food and housing. The end result is that we will come out of the recession a little more slowly than we would have, but we will also have a greater degree of independence than we would have.
Do you see this as a drag on the U.S. economy for the rest of this decade?
Yes, I do, but perhaps we should turn it around. You know, the glass can be either seen as half full or half empty. Maybe we should say that the last 30 years have been an incredible run during which we've taken advantage of an unreal long-term element, terribly cheap energy prices and costs. Perhaps now it would be fair to say that we're bumping up against reality.
Or in other words, that our future is going to include higher prices for oil, for energy, and for all the things that they go into. Probably nothing bothers people more in an inflation than rising food prices. People can put off buying some things, but they cannot put off eating, so they cannot put off buying food. Repeated and continuing rises in food prices remind people that their economic fortunes are being affected for the worse. Over the past year alone, food prices have gone up 12%. No one is predicting how much they will increase over the whole of 1975, but it looks as though they will go up another 7 or 8% in the first 6 months, rising at an annual rate of 15%. Bob Jameson reports.
The winter wheat crop in the Midwest, the source of flour for bread, is dormant now. The first hard prairie freeze stopped its growth in December. When the spring rains come, this largest part of America's food grain crop will grow again. And if the weather this spring is good, farmers could have the largest winter wheat crop ever. Farmers in the breadbasket planted more wheat in the fall than in 1973. It is a natural response to high prices for their grain, prices increased by worldwide demand. And prices affected as well by inflation that has hit the farm, meaning everything the farmer uses, machinery, petroleum, fertilizer, even fence posts have shot up in cost. Some economists believe lowering the price of food these farmers raise is the first key to reducing inflation. In 1974, American farmers planted every available acre in grain, wheat, corn, and soybeans. Worldwide demand was great, but America's grain reserves were at their lowest point in 2 decades. But the nation's farmers watched as the worst weather in years destroyed their plans for a bumper crop. Planting was late and early growth was damaged by heavy spring rains that left the fields water-soaked for weeks. The rain stopped. A drought further damaged the 1974 grain crop. Toward the end of summer, rain did come again, but not soon enough to prevent serious damage. The drought was followed by an early frost that further reduced the crop of corn and soybeans and damaged the quality of the grain that could be salvaged. The 1974 wheat harvests were encouraging, the largest ever, but exports over the last several years have depleted reserves to their lowest point in 25 years, and in 1975, worldwide demand is not expected to lessen. The corn harvest in 1974 was disappointing, nearly 100 million bushels below the 1973 harvest. And the 1974 harvest of soybeans was 300 million bushels below the 1973 record crop. The reserves of those grains, too, have been depleted, particularly stockpiles of corn, which are now dangerously low. What lingering effect will all of this have on food prices in 1975? Meat prices may go up and supplies of beef may go down. That's because cattle are fed on corn and soybeans, and right now those grains are expensive. In addition, raising beef cattle for slaughter isn't profitable now, so farmers are cutting back on production, which may eventually mean smaller supplies and higher prices. And it may mean more grass-fed beef as well, beef that will not be as tender. In the supermarket, as surprising as it may seem, nearly 70% of everything sold is derived from corn or soybeans, or their powders, flours, and syrups. And with those grains in shorter supply, higher prices will result for at least a while. But while supplies are shorter, worldwide demand in the marketplace for American grain is still running high. Even if there is a record winter wheat crop, the price of that grain will probably remain high. Futures prices for next summer's wheat crop are already higher than they were a year ago, and if that trend continues, that loaf of bread will also increase in price. A good crop of corn, wheat, and soybeans in 1975 could help bring food prices down. But early in the new year, the most difficult thing to predict is the weather, which will have the final say on how much farmers produce in 1975. Bob Jameson, NBC News, Reno County, Kansas.
If farmers are uncertain about their crops, workers are afraid for their jobs. On the national level, unemployment is a waste. On the individual level, unemployment can be a tragedy. People out of work, fired, feel cut off from their normal world. They feel unwanted. They may become demoralized and desperate. Well, unemployment in the United States now is at its highest level in 13 years. At least 6 million people are out of work, where a year ago there were 4,300,000. The rate now is more than 6.5% of the labor force. Irving R. Levine reports on unemployment, past and present.
Unemployed men selling apples on street corners were symbolic of the Great Depression, and so were soup kitchens to feed the hungry when 25% of the nation's workers couldn't find jobs. Maybe the unemployment figure was even higher. No one was sure. But now, in the computer age, the figures are more accurate. In the Great Depression, a person was sometimes reduced to walking the streets to advertise for a job. But today, some jobs are unfilled because they require people with scarce skills or special experience. Some jobs go begging because the pay is low. Other jobs attract only people who want to work occasionally or part-time. Low-paid jobs go begging for another reason. Unemployment insurance checks provide income for most people who have lost their jobs for 26 weeks and longer in some states. In the Great Depression, free employment agencies, like this one in New York, were opened by city governments to help people find jobs. Again, today, people wait for assistance in finding suitable jobs at employment centers run by states and by the federal government. But the difficulty in finding work varies widely in the nation's population. Among married men, 3.9% are now out of work. Among adult women, 6.6% can't find jobs. As for adult blacks, 11.7% are without jobs. And among all teenagers, 17.3% want a job and can't find one. But these statistics can be misleading in some respects. For example, a teenager who occasionally babysits but has not had a call lately is counted as unemployed. On the other hand, an adult who has become discouraged and has temporarily stopped looking for a job is not counted among the unemployed. Administration officials expect unemployment to climb to about 7% from the present 6.5% before it starts to decline. However, many economists predict that unemployment will climb to 8% or even higher. That still is far below the Great Depression level, but for the individuals who comprise the unemployment statistics, that fact doesn't make their plight any easier. Irving R. Levine, NBC News, Washington.
Wherever you look across the United States, plants are closing, industries are slowing down, businesses are failing. As an example, fewer houses are being built, so the lumber industry has been hurt. People aren't buying so many cars, so steel and other auto-related industries are having layoffs. And those are just a few dots on a map studded with sadness caused by double-digit inflation and a steadily deepening recession. We picked one town outside Pittsburgh which has been suffering from the phasing out of an aluminum plant. The town is New Kensington in Pennsylvania. What it has been going through is the kind of thing facing many cities across the country. Betty Rowland reports.
New Kensington, like so many economically troubled American towns today, is full of what used to be. Alcoa used to be here. At one time, it employed more than 9,000 people. New Kensington used to be called the Aluminum City. Now what's left of Alcoa employs 178 people. And, says the mayor, the only aluminum we see anymore is on a used beer can.
When the Alcoa plant left town, so did a lot of people. The population of New Kensington used to be about 25,000. Now it's about 20,000. And the people who left were the young and the middle-aged. The workers, in other words, and the spenders. New Kensington now has an unemployment rate of 10%. 20% of the town are retirees, like these Alcoa men enjoying their weekly bowling night. Company pensions have enabled many of them to live fairly comfortably, but not so comfortably that they contribute much to the economy of their town. When workers and their families were around and spending money, they spent it here in downtown New Kensington. In those days, the big stores like Montgomery Ward and J.C. Penney used to be here. Now, in part because of Alcoa's departure and because of the general trend, those stores have pulled out to the shopping centers. This is what's left. Prostitutes are not the most reliable barometer of a town's fiscal health, but one old-timer noted that even they are gone. In general, as good business fizzled in New Kensington, so did good times.
I had a terrific bar business here. I used to have customers lined at this, in front of this bar, 3 and 4 deep. And Friday and Saturday night, they would be standing on the steps waiting to come down to enjoy the atmosphere and what we had to offer, the services here. And finally, we had to close this room entirely. If we could only convince the younger generation to stay here in their own backyard instead of, well, trying to explore other parts of the country.
It's not that the young people of New Kensington don't think their hometown is as good as other places. It's just that there are no jobs here.
Phoebe, don't... Right, back up with them.
So after graduation, they leave. And before. You wouldn't guess, looking at the crowd at the high school basketball game, that the school's enrollment dropped from 6,000 in 1968 to 4,800 today.
Back up!
Even under normal conditions, high school kids in small towns often want to go elsewhere for jobs after graduation. But these kids used to have a choice. There used to be jobs in New Kensington if they wanted to stay here. Not anymore.
Jobs around here are small. I don't think there's any openings for electricians around here, for what I want, anyway. Not right now, there isn't.
Now, has this come to you from your friends or relatives that the jobs are few and far between?
From relatives, friends. From what I see in the paper, a lot of people are losing their jobs.
So you're willing to go out of the territory then?
Right.
In other words, you don't feel too bad about leaving New Kensington?
Well, I like it here, but if I have to go, get a job,
New Kensington has tried mightily to entice new industry to its town, with some success. This is a new industrial area. The new organ company in town employs 180 people. Women mostly, for about $2 an hour.
And a extra dry martini.
And this cocktail party was given to officially welcome a new rust-proofing company. It employs 25.
If you got into chromium and nickel, how many new employees do you think that would bring in if you got into a total operation?
The main thing is we need small industry.
Yeah, I was going to say, we do need industry.
The industrial part can use as many of those type of industries they can get.
And I think they're on the right track because hopefully if the rails get moving, they have a ready-made artery.
Perfect location.
A solution of sorts for some people in New Kensington, short of leaving the town altogether, has been to remain living here, but to work somewhere else. At 7 o'clock every morning, this commuter bus takes workers to Pittsburgh. But of course, many workers there are getting laid off as well. Some community leaders here feel that it wouldn't be a bad thing if New Kensington became more of a solely residential place, a place where people came just to live. But in order to entice homeowners, these same people admit New Kensington would have to spruce up. And there's not much money these days for sprucing. Alcoa was more than just a plant in this town. It was the town's identity. The company did a lot to make its demise painless, but it has been suggested it might have done more. And the people here might have done more, simply to face the fact that a death was happening. Even now, many people still cling to the ghost of the good old days, and they talk not about change, but about resurrection. Betty Rollin, NBC News, New Kensington, Pennsylvania.
Those are real problems for New Kensington and for the rest of the country. To assess those problems, we've brought together a panel of experts. Walter Heller, former chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors, Milton Friedman, economist and columnist, Louis Rukeyser, host of the PBS program Wall Street Week. Lou, do you have any answers for us?
Well, Ed, economists always have answers. The problem is that they often have several different answers to the same question. Let's start with this question of recession and unemployment. How did we get into this mess, and what ought we to do to get out of it? Walter Heller?
Well, Lou, we're in kind of a three-way squeeze. Number one, oil has picked our pockets of about $20 to $25 billion. That's not come back into the economy. Number two, money has been terribly tight in the effort to fight inflation. And number three, the federal budget has been tightening by any economist's standard and has been putting downward pressure on the economy. I think that is taking some of the inflationary steam out of the economy. It's high time we recognize that inflation is not now public enemy number one. It's recession. We're headed for 8% unemployment, 7.5 million unemployed in the middle of 1975. And it's high time that we reversed gears, that we gave back to the taxpayer some of the money that's been picked out of his pocket by inflation with a $15 to $20 billion tax cut, and that we ease up on money.
Milton Friedman, I suspect you take a somewhat different view.
I think our recession is really a consequence of our prior inflation. I think our problems are due to an overdose of the kind of fine-tuning that Walter has just been recommending. In the search to get the economy keyed up, we pour in too much money and too much steam. We get an inflation going. Then we step too hard on the brake, get a recession. And now Walter is recommending that we again step too hard on the accelerator. I think that we need to keep a steady, moderate course. Inflation at the moment is going to taper off a little. The recession is a severe problem, there's no doubt. But I think that we must take a course of moderate monetary restraint, moderate fiscal restraint, in order to get out of the recession without launching us on a new wave of inflation.
In your rogues gallery, is inflation still public enemy number one?
Inflation and recession are not two different things. The recession is the effect of the prior inflationary policies, but inflation is a fundamental thing we have to control.
Walter Heller, do you think we're going to have to make permanent changes in the American way of life because of the increased cost of oil and other international commodities?
To some extent. There isn't any question that the price of oil relative to other things, the price of certain other commodities has gone up and is going to stay up relative to other things. Now, mind you, I think as we produce more oil, as we develop more other sources, it'll come down somewhat. But I don't think we ever again are going to have the cheap energy that we had. And as a consequence, we do have to make some adjustments towards smaller cars, towards better insulated homes, and so forth.
What's your view, Milton Friedman?
The price of oil will come down. The oil crisis has caused us great economic costs, there is no doubt. We've had a large transfer of wealth from us and from countries who are consuming oil to countries who are producing oil. But the most serious problem for this year of the oil crisis, in my opinion, is its political effects in the Middle East. The cartel at the moment is holding. It will sooner or later break. But the problem is that before it breaks, it may bring down the Middle East in flames, and goodness knows what the consequences of that would be.
Let's talk again about one of the problems we have here at home. We've just seen in New Kensington the problem of unemployment. How bad do you think that's going to get?
Well, it's very hard to make an exact estimate. Economists' predictions have not been very good. We don't have a good forecasting record. It's obviously going to get worse than it is. But my own belief is that it is not going to get much worse. As to what we ought to do about it, it's clear that we must make provision for taking care of the people who are in serious distress. I think President Ford's proposals for improving the unemployment insurance system from this point are very good. But again, we must have a longer view. We must not try to resolve today's problems at the expense of creating still worse problems a year after that.
Walter Heller, you've talked about 8% this year.
8%? That's 7.5 million unemployed. I'm not willing to stand by and let that many people be unemployed when I can see that we can prevent some of it and at the same time have inflation continue to ebb.
But you
Milton Friedman wants to come back, but we just can't do it now. We will be back later in the program for more of this discussion.
We'll be back in a moment to look at productivity, profits, and prices. Who loses and who gains?
World events of the past year will be examined in an NBC News special. This is Jess Marlowe. I'll be joined by the Channel 4 news staff for a perspective of 1974 and a preview of 1975.
Tonight at 8 on Channel 4. KNBC, Los Angeles. One moment, please. We will return to the program scheduled in just a few seconds.
Right now, it's pointing down. It includes a look at the housing industry. Building permits are down, which is bad. It examines how much money people borrow. They're borrowing less, and that's a sign of lack of confidence in the future. It counts new unemployment claims, which are up, and that speaks for itself. This index is not a crystal ball, but it does provide one of the best clues to what is in store. It also takes a look at productivity, that important measure of our working efficiency. Jack Paxton has a report on that.
Productivity is a key word in any economy. It helps determine prices and profits. High productivity makes for high living standards and competitiveness in foreign markets. Productivity is not production. It is efficiency of production, how much you get out of what you put in. Americans have always taken pride in their productivity. Yankee ingenuity, inventing, building, and using everything better than anyone else. The fact is, Americans are no longer doing that so well. Their efficiency of production is dropping. For a while, it was merely that productivity increases were not as great as they had been. Now, productivity is actually declining. It has declined 4 quarters in a row, something that hadn't happened since the Depression. One recent quarter, it dropped 7%. That had never happened. Economists fear it's more than the usual productivity cycle. They fear it's a reflection of a deeper economic ailment dating back 7 or 8 years. One popular theory is that productivity is declining because people don't want to work anymore, want everything for nothing. Economists say that's not really true. They say it's not the working man's attitude, but his wage that is hurting productivity. Wages have increased so rapidly that some employers can't make a reasonable profit without inflating the price of their product. Even more damaging to productivity, according to the experts, is a shortage of capital to buy machinery and improve technology, a capital shortage caused partly by inflation. But even those who have it are reluctant to invest when the future looks as uncertain as it does now. The steel and auto industries are examples of what can happen in terms of productivity, good and bad. A few years ago, production in the steel industry was inefficient. Then unions and management joined in a drive against sloppy practices, and management spent a lot of money to modernize machinery. Money and machinery, the capital and technology so important to productivity. The result for the steel industry was a complete turnaround, a record productivity increase last year of 11%. The auto industry went the other way, from high to low productivity, largely because inflation and the fuel shortage knocked the bottom out of demand for cars. It must be said that steel got its good marks while demand for steel was high, while the car companies' productivity dropped largely because of circumstances they couldn't control.
Which is to say, productivity is a complicated subject. Not enough is known. In 1970, the government established a national commission on productivity, but experts say it hasn't been very productive. While the experts can't agree on a solution, they do agree the problem is getting critical. Jack Paxton, NBC News, Cleveland.
Since November 1949, the dollar has consistently lost purchasing power. If you had held on to a dollar bill since November 1949, today it would buy only as much as 46 cents bought 25 years ago. Overall, consumer prices have risen more than 116%. That's on average. It covers everything from work clothes to tuxedos, from cars to farm tractors, from gasoline to electricity, soup to nuts. If you could put a little of everything in one basket, what would have cost you $100 at the end of 1949 would have cost you more than $193 at the end of 1973 and more than $216 at the end of 1974. Going through a 25-year-old newspaper, some of the prices you see advertised are hard to believe. This newspaper itself has gone up 400% in 25 years. Now take the food ads for prices in the New York, New Jersey metropolitan area. Eggs, 53 cents a dozen. Bread, 16 to 18 cents a loaf. Rib roast, 49 cents a pound. Coke, 6-ounce bottles, 6 for a quarter. Now take a look at today's average prices for food and how they've changed over the last 25 years. Eggs are now 81 cents a dozen. Bread is 35.8 cents a loaf on average across the country. Rib roast, $1.60 a pound. The national average price for chicken is one of the few that's actually gone down over the last 25 years. Of course, it is true that while the value of the dollar has shrunk over those 25 years, people's earnings have risen. In November 1949, a factory worker with a family of 4 had $52.59 a week in real spendable earnings after taxes. In November 1974, he had $155.18, so that it appears that the average factory worker was 200% better off than he was 25 years ago. But when you count in the huge increase in prices, it turns out that he's only about 35% better off in real purchasing power. What is more, in the past year, the average manufacturing worker has seen things move in the opposite direction. He has seen more than 5% of his spending power disappear, about $1.10 for every $20 in his paycheck. And it looks as though the average worker will continue to lose spending power for some time to come, until the rate of inflation drops below the rate of his wage increases. Now, there may be another complication. Companies raise their prices to cover rising costs. And sometimes it turns out that these companies report sharply higher profits. And it looks as though prices went up more than the cost did, which may make people angry. Now, look at what's happened to profits for various industries in the third quarter of 1974. Food processing up 23% over the third quarter of 73. Fuel profits up 50%. Steel, which goes into almost every manufactured product, profits up 182%, and that's without the most recent round of steel price increases. On the other hand, other industries are not doing so well. The automobile industry's profits were off 58%. The appliance industry was off 62%. And real estate and housing showed a loss, all of which is confusing. Perhaps Walter Heller and Milton Friedman with Louis Rukeyser can help to clear it up.
Well, Ed will certainly try. Milton Friedman, you suggested that recession and inflation are really parts of the same problem. What is the origin of this problem?
The origin of the problem is too much government spending, too much government printing of money, and too much fine-tuning. Those are the 3 components. The too much spending, the too much printing of money produces inflation. The too much fine-tuning then tries to offset it by producing recessions, which in turn are overreacted to.
Walter Heller, you wouldn't agree with that.
That's just a vastly oversimplified, that's a discussion of the problem, because you have to look at the world as it is. The world will not tolerate mass unemployment. If Milton Friedman's formula were pursued, we would have to go into 8, 9, 10, 12% unemployment for substantial periods of time.
This is scared talk for which you have not the slightest bit of evidence. The fact is that your and my predictions and other people's predictions about this kind of a relationship have been very poor, and my own impression is that if we follow your policy, it will add to unemployment, not reduce it.
Oh, indeed not. After all, and as a matter of fact, right now, if you provide some stimulus for the economy, it's going to help on both the recession and the inflation fronts, because What is the long-run solution to inflation? Well, in part, it's higher productivity. It's avoiding shortages and bottlenecks. And if you make the economy, if you knock it flat on its back, people are going to stop investing. They're going to stop doing the very things that you need to do to cope with inflation in the longer run.
This is where we came in. It is precisely those policies that have put us in our present situation. Those policies led to inflation rates of about 4% in '66, of about 7%, 9% in '69, of about 12% now. We're on a roller coaster.
Are you suggesting that the government should do nothing to stimulate the economy now?
The government should, in my opinion, continue on a moderate monetary policy of expansion of the quantity of money at a slow rate, on a moderate fiscal policy. I am all in favor of cutting taxes at any time, under any circumstances, provided you also cut spending. If you both cut taxes and spending, you will significantly stimulate the economy in the right way, in the effective way of providing business with an incentive to invest, of reducing interest rates so that housing will recover. If, on the other hand, you insist on running large government deficits, which will strain the credit markets, will raise interest rates, you are very likely to destroy the potential housing revival in process. But more important, we have to look ahead. We might be able to save a little bit of unemployment in '75 at the expense of a lot more in '77 or '78 when we come to 15, 18% inflation, and once again we have to ask, what do we do?
Walter, are you at all concerned that stimulating too much might set off more inflation?
Absolutely, but a $15 to $20 billion stimulus is a minor stimulus. It is less than it is about half a year's normal growth in federal revenues. It is less than the amount that inflation has increased the effective rates of the federal tax. After all, Milton Friedman has said he wants to index tax rates. If you had indexed individual income tax rates today,
what that means?
Well, he wants to adjust them for inflation. And if he adjusts them for inflation, he would today have to give away $20 billion for the last 2 years' inflation. And if you at the same time cut expenditures, then the economy gets nothing out of it.
You see the problem. Walter refers to giving away. The truth is that it's our money that's being taken.
Well, I'll say then giving back,
no,
if that makes you happier.
I agree with him that taxes are much too high, and I am all in favor of cutting taxes. But the crucial thing is to cut taxes really. If we only cut taxes but keep spending up, then we will be driven again to impose the tax of inflation. We have to pay for what government spends. There is no free lunch in here. We can't get something for nothing. And the most important thing we need to do in this country is to give the ordinary man more of his own money to spend for himself instead of having it being spent for him by bigger and bigger government.
But Milton, if we were running full employment today, we would be taking in about $30 billion more than we're paying out. And I don't believe the economy can get back to full employment with that kind of an overburden. And I want to strip off that overburden.
We're going to come back a little later and talk some more about these subjects. I know you two would like to have at each other. I think it's interesting that economists who disagree so much with one another and who are often unpopular with the rest of the populace do manage to come together on this one issue that is always popular, which is that we ought to cut our taxes. So on that degree of unanimity, we at least have cleared up one point, and we'll be back for more discussion a little later on in the program.
Booms and busts, inflations and recessions feed on themselves. For example, when things are going well, people feel optimistic, they buy a lot, and things get even better. Now, when prices are going up, people generally expect that they will continue to go up, and they buy in a hurry. So, to nobody's surprise, prices go even higher. However, when things begin to look dark, people become afraid. They try to stop buying. Maybe they even have to stop buying. And to nobody's surprise, things look even darker, and prospects become worse. Well, that last is what's happening to us right now. The combination of inflation and recession has made consumers more pessimistic than at any time since the Second World War. Now, we took a look at 3 families to find out how various people are coping with the situation. You will see first a young couple who are beginning to feel the pinch. Then a middle-income family already deep in financial trouble. And finally, a woman living on Social Security who is barely making ends meet, except in spirit.
When Paul and Susan Perkins were married in 1973, their parents were too poor to afford a wedding. So the two of them paid for the wedding out of their own pockets. Paul, who's 20, and Susan, who's 19, are a very independent couple. Paul Perkins began working to help support himself before he got out of high school. Now he's an apprentice repairman at the Hughes Tool Company, earning $4.30 an hour. Business is so good right now that Paul works a 6-day week. That gives him about $700 a month in take-home pay. With his wages, plus his wife's earnings as a secretary, the two of them were able to save enough money to buy a small house, something that's impossible for most young couples to do these days. They're glad they've got the house because Susan is about to have a baby. The child is due later this month. Susan quit her job when she became pregnant, so now they have to get by on Paul's paycheck. Although his earnings are good, the two of them say they have to watch every penny very carefully.
Do you sit down and actually plan out a family budget?
Oh, yeah. You have to.
Every month, we sit down and see, how much food has gone up and how much extra money we have, how much we get each paycheck, what's left over after we pay the bills. He gets $5 for the next week and I get $5 for the next week, and that's it.
Neither of you seem to be too awfully worried about the future. Is that a true statement?
No, because you hear a lot on the news now that there's going to be a depression by, middle of next summer, something like that. I worry about that sometimes. I wonder what it's like and what'll happen. You never can tell.
I guess I live to the past. Last year was such a nice year that next year has to be, it couldn't be all bad.
John O'Donnell is a newspaper reporter in New Kensington, Pennsylvania. He used to have another job in a research plant nearby, but suddenly he got laid off. So as the cost of living doubled, his income was halved. John O'Donnell is luckier than some people. He still does have a job which he likes and which pays him $9,000 a year. O'Donnell and his wife and son are scraping along at a time in their lives when they expected to be flourishing.
Sometimes, during some of our more discouraging moments, it seems like the bottom is just going to collapse sometime.
We have a beautiful home, don't get me wrong. We love it, but you can't sit in your house 24 hours a day. We never go anywhere and never do anything, and it really bugs me.
What kind of things did you used to do that you don't do anymore?
Oh, I love dancing, and I love a show, and I love going out and having a drink or two. I mean, you get out. We went to a show not too long ago, well, maybe 6 months ago. And I said, boy, I feel like I was in New York somewhere. I was in a different world because I come out, big screen and buildings, and I said, boy, that sure changes your life. We said we were going to go once a month. It never happens.
Have you had to cut down on basic things?
I get what's on sale, like ground meat or tuna fish, hot dogs, and buy a lot of soups.
Mm-hmm. Did you expect 5-10 years ago that you'd be doing that?
No. I thought we'd be setting it. We could do we never go on vacations or anything. And I love to buy, as you can see. I love to buy things, small or big. And if you don't think that's a letdown, I just pass it up. It's your home, and eating comes first. And what's left, if you have anything, then you do it. But if you don't. So I'd like to save before anything now, if possible. Before going out and before getting a big meal on a table, I'd like to put away now, this time, and not take any more chances.
Have these changes been good for you in any way?
In one way, we're much more level-headed about finances now, by necessity. Obviously, we can't do the things we did before, but so you might say that this sort of builds character in a sense, but in another way, there's a certain element of bitterness there, too. We just live day by day and just try to keep our head above water.
I'm afraid, though, that with things going up and our pay we can't manage it, our house payment's going to go up. Everything goes up, taxes and everything. It keeps going up. What do you do?
When she was younger, Mrs. Jane Weintraub managed to work,
and raise a family at the same time. It was not easy. Now her husband's dead, her children have grown and gone, and she lives alone in New York City. Her savings were almost completely wiped out by the recent plunge in the stock market. So today, she relies on Social Security to live. She gets $249.20 a month. Mrs. Weintraub is 77 years old.
During my productive years, I think that I have made a contribution to society. I think I have enriched this society by being alive, by the fact that I have brought up a family, the fact that I have worked, and the fact that I have given of myself to the betterment of the whole aspect of life. And now I want to get some of the fruits of that life by leisure, by travel, by participation in activities which I could not do while I was engaged in earning a living. I'm afraid I haven't been able to do that. On the contrary, I'm afraid that my income now being curtailed so drastically, I have to begin again to worry about whether I dare buy a pair of shoes. Or do I dare buy an extra bite to eat? It's ridiculous. It's almost ludicrous for a person to reach this age and worry about the very same things that you worried about as a younger person. She's entitled, society owes it to her. Since she invested her life, her strength, and her creativity in society, society should stand by her and say, now in your later years, you're entitled to a quiet life, a happy life, and an open life. Nothing should be closed to you. That's within reason.
That was your American dream, wasn't it?
It was. I'm afraid it will not be achieved in my lifetime.
Gentlemen, Mrs. Weintraub has raised an important and provocative question. What does our society, as she put it, owe to its citizens? Walter Heller?
Well, it's really a question of what, in a sense, do we owe to each other in a democracy. And I think, first of all, we owe each other equality of opportunity, and that's something we have to do collectively rather than individually. And that means, secondly, that those who are denied by the conditions of the economy and the conditions of society, who are denied equal opportunity, have to have a certain amount of collective support from government, whether it's because of unemployment or old age or other kinds of disadvantagement. And third, I think that when you have a system in which there are rewards for effort, you ought to do everything possible to see to it that efforts are rewarded. And if you have spent a lifetime, a productive lifetime, and you are in retirement, like Mrs. Weintraub, you should provide a reasonable level of living and of being able to do some of the things that she can't do from the labors, as it were, of those who are still employed.
Milton Friedman, how do you approach that question?
Now, I think putting the question in those terms of what does society owe citizens grossly misstates the issue and is responsible for a lot of our difficulties, because it suggests that there's some collective body society that it can owe something to somebody. That's not true. Only people can owe. Only people have obligations. Our real problem is how do we, as a group of people individually, cooperate together in promoting our separate values? And there, I think the fundamental problem that Mrs. Weintraub's comments points to is that our democratic institutions have failed. They have failed to enable us to express our true values. She is suffering, and many of us are suffering from a tax that nobody ever voted for. That is the cruel tax of inflation. The tax of inflation is a reflection of the fact that we don't have a properly operating democratic and political system. And I think what we need is to have a system in which we as individuals can have a greater degree of freedom to pursue our own interests, in which we are controlled less by Big Brother in Washington, in which less of our money is taken off there, and in which taxes are not imposed on us without our having voted explicitly for them.
Gentlemen, I want to turn from the past and the present to the future, but first I want to ask this. As Milton suggested himself earlier, economic forecasting is in bad odor these days. In fact, as a group, you economists are not thought of much better probably than politicians. What went wrong? Why were your forecasts so bad? Walter?
Well, remember that up until 1972, as a matter of fact, 72, we were right on the button. It was 73, which was the year of infamy in inflation forecasting, because we did not foresee that there would be quadrupling of oil prices. We didn't see that there'd be world food shortages. We didn't see that the anchovies would disappear. We didn't see that there'd be the great grain robbery by the Russians. It's true, we didn't foresee those. Neither did anyone else. For this year, the Federal Reserve suddenly turned tail on us about last February or March, and as a result, we were thrown off in the second half of the year. I think it's quite clear this time around that with the forces already at work, the recession is going to get worse. I have a lot of faith in the consensus forecast, which is that by the middle of this year, 1975, we will be around 7.5% to 8% unemployment, and the recession will be very deep indeed. Especially if Mr. Ford takes the right moves and the Federal Reserve takes the right moves, we'll be starting to move up in the second half of the year.
Milton Friedman?
There is a great deal of uncertainty in the economy. We've got lots of individuals. We've got lots of people pursuing their own lives. It's not to be expected that we should be able to forecast precisely. I think the great harm which economists have done is not their imperfection of forecast, but they're claiming to be better able to do it than they really are. We have claimed too much, and in the result, we have done ourselves and the world a good deal of harm. Now, that doesn't keep any of us from continuing to look in that clouded crystal ball.
But does that consensus forecast that Walter mentioned sweep wide enough to include you?
If you state it in broad enough terms, I think that the
How much unemployment, how much inflation?
I think the recession will be starting to ease off, and recovery will be beginning in the third quarter of next year, roughly. I think inflation will be tapering off. I think on January 1st, 1976, we will be feeling happier about the situation, but perhaps falsely so, because at that time, looming ahead of us, will be another, in my opinion, inflationary surge, which will have been built in by the overreaction during 1975 to the problem of unemployment.
Lou, I thought I was going to be agreeing with Milton for a moment, and I can agree with him to this extent that a year from now, yes, we will be feeling a lot better, but I will go him one better. I think that not only the recovery prospect, but the inflation prospect will be better. That a lot of the inflation we've been going through is a one-time adjustment to oil prices and food prices, and to the devaluation of the dollar, and that will no longer be ahead of us, and we will be facing a much more moderate inflationary pace. Not low enough. We're not going to be satisfied with it. It'll look an awful lot better than the perspective we have right now on January 1st,
this is a problem of time perspective. If you look ahead for the next year, that's right. But if you look ahead for the next 2 or 3 years, we're heading toward 15, 20% inflation by 1977 or 78, along the lines that Walter outlined.
I know Walter doesn't agree.
You want to bet?
We don't.
Yes,
we want
I'd be glad to.
You know, we do have, again, a little consensus. Both these gentlemen think that come 12 months from today, the mood of the country will be better. Walter Heller thinks deservedly so. Milton Friedman says we'll be kidding ourselves. In any event, thank you, gentlemen. Now back to Ed.
1974 was, to put it mildly, an unusual year for Americans. We saw a president of the United States resign. And while the country's political machinery functioned, we're not sure about our political health. Economically also, it was a difficult year. Power moved to new areas, and we became, economically speaking, much less the master of our fate, the captain of our soul. We obviously believe that we will come through our troubles, but there is not much unalloyed optimism about. 1975 will provide a further test of our political system. It will also provide a further test of our economic resiliency. It will show us whether we can bounce back. Edwin Newman, NBC News.